Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Swimmer. I am the Executive Director of the Episcopal Parish Network, formerly known as the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, or CEEP Network. Welcome to the first EPN digital workshop following our Atlanta conference back in February. We are so pleased to be joined by our panelists today who presented a version of this workshop in Atlanta to our attendees. It was very well received, and they graciously agreed to do a slightly shorter, modified version for you all today. We're so glad to have them with us. We look forward to additional digital workshop offerings in the coming weeks following Easter. In the meantime, from the Episcopal Parish Network, we wish you a blessed end to Lent and a joyful and wonderful Easter and Eastertide. With that, I'm going to hand it over to James and let them get started. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Joe. What a joy to be here with you all today. In the middle of Holy Week, it's actually a good thing to take a little time this week and do some reflecting and not just directly Holy Week related. So we're glad to have you. Can we just take about 30 seconds just to quiet ourselves a little bit before we dig into some great stuff? Let's pray. Good and gracious God, we thank you for this time to reflect on our life together, on the ministry to which you've called us, to all the ways you've had your loving hand guiding us through the centuries. Bless this time and this conversation, that we would learn and grow and be encouraged in our fellowship together. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. So we've got basically three pieces of looking at the past, because the fact is, what we've been living the last couple of years is not completely new, is it, Bob? There are some ways that we can. I find it so helpful to kind of go, oh my gosh, we've actually been through some of this before. Maybe not exactly the same, but talk to us about some of that.
Yeah. So I think James, the similarities to the human and societal reactions to the 14th century bubonic and pneumonic plague and the COVID-19 pandemic are frighteningly similar. Medicine, of course, was the same, but people acted similarly. I mean, medicine wasn't the same, but the way people acted was. There were lockdowns back then, lockdowns, of course, now. Preventative measures were taken, some later discarded. But one of the brutal realities of both is the trauma that was left in their wakes was significant. Perhaps like the opening weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, during the plague, experts had little hope to offer. People fell ill and lasted 2 days or 3 days. In the fall of 1348, letters from the bishops to the congregations in England, across England, announced the plague's arrival on the shores there, and it frightened everybody. Local priests called for increased devotions, special prayers during daily masses, and devout processions on Fridays, which many people did faithfully, more than they had in the past. There's a small town called Walsham, England, and it's really one of the best examples of what happened. It's located to the east of Cambridge, England, and its population was about 1,500 in 1348. But by the summer of 1349, the plague had claimed 750 to 900 people. It's a lot of people. And how it happened, remarkably, right? At the beginning of Holy Week, 673 years ago, the plague hit the Walsham area. And by Easter, about a half a dozen people had fever and chills, and then the black pustules emerged on their skin. And within 2 weeks, the bells of St. Mary's, the local church, tolled almost without ceasing. It seemed that all humankind would perish, and by May, the clergy oversaw up to 30 burials a day. The clergy feared the contagion as much as anyone else and struggled to provide spiritual courage for their parishioners. Some abandoned their posts, never to be seen again. Others hid and never coming out during the plague's duration. But those most connected to their people worked themselves to exhaustion. No surprise. In the end, the plague dramatically changed people's mindsets. And one of the best examples of this comes from the London cleric William Langland's poem, Piers Plowman. And he writes, "For God is deaf nowadays and will not hear us. And for our guilt, he grinds good men to dust." And James, I think, and Jessica, I mean, I think that really, begins to give us that sense of not just apocalyptic, but on the ground of how people emotionally reacted to it.
Yeah. It's interesting too, Jessica, hearing that, how similar. I remember, I doubt I'm the only one who remembers thinking, well, we'll suspend worship here. We'll be back by Easter. And then a couple of weeks later, we said, well, whatever Sunday we come back, we'll make that Easter. And then it's 9 months later. We're like, well, that got scuttled. So now how do we do this? But Jessica, talk to me for a minute. So when I think of trauma, Jessica, I think of a moment, right? It's a car wreck. It's some moment that is physically and psychologically jarring. And so there's part of me that thinks, oh my gosh, we're overusing the word trauma, but this is traumatic in a different way. Can you talk what does it mean in this case when we're dealing with something that's months long and all that?
Sure. So I think it's possible that trauma can be an event. The reality is that for many of us, trauma is an experience, right? It's an internal experience, really, of our sense of safety being disturbed and ripped from us, right? And the question that trauma leaves us with is, will we be safe again? Will I be able to be at home in my body, in my family, in my community? And certainly we've had to tackle these questions. We were kind of talking before the webinar started about some of the tensions we face around this return to normal. And for me, all those big questions are us tackling, are we safe? Are we really safe? So the next time we meet, will we have to wear a mask then? And how many more boosters will we have to take, right? And so I think it caused us to deal with the precarity of safety as we once experienced it. I mean, I still sometimes, when I'm looking at pictures from early 2020, I'm like, I cannot believe all those people were in a room together with no masks, right? I mean, we are indelibly changed by this experience, and the way we relate to Christian community and to God has been changed because we have to reckon with how much we've lost.
Do you hear people, people of faith today, Jessica, saying things like Bob quoted in the poem, this sort of just, which to me sounded just brutally honestly defeated?
Well, so I think a part of, and this kind of depends on our theological leanings too, right? Is what permission do we feel to express our anger and frustration and even our sense of the absence of God at times in our lives, right? And I would argue it's true whether we give voice to it or not. And I think we have an opportunity to make space for those questions in our rejoining processes, right? I mean, who is the God who's allowed millions of people to die, right? Millions of people to die? Who is the God who has caused even those who survived, right, to have these long-term effects? And I think we don't always tackle those big questions openly, but now we're forced to.
So Bob, let me ask you, was there must have been theological shifting sand. There must have been during the plague, people who were going, I don't need to stay away. God will protect me. If we're faithful, this won't touch us. And others going, don't be stupid, stay home. Was there some of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there was a
Yeah.
sense of like, I can pray this away. I mean, there was certainly that. I mean, particularly in the beginning, kind of before, as the plague gets closer and closer to, I mean, so Walsham's north of London. So they're here. I mean, people were connected, not the way we're connected today, but people knew about the plague in Italy. And then as it's progressing, because there was a lot of shipping and exchange going on and trade going on. So there was kind of rumors of something bad happening, and then it was getting closer and getting closer. And so people thought, hey, I can pray. If we just pray more, everything's going to be fine. And then there was a monk who said, the best thing to do if the plague hits your town is to isolate, and if not just run, just flee. And so, here you have, some religious person, there's no theology there. That's just pure fear. But there were people who would, blamed other people, blamed the clergy even, and they saw it in terms of God punishing them for their guilt, for some sin that had been committed by humans, that this was often what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
But that was something, that was just kind of in plague.
Yeah.
Or,
so just
during the event.
Yeah. And just a reminder, folks, that we, if you have questions that you want to share with us, put them in the chat and we'll make sure we see those. That's the place to use for that. So Jessica, I'm one of your imagine you're coaching me. I'm in the middle of all this. I'm starting to come back to worship, and I sit down with you and I'm just like, I think people are coming back, but I don't know if people are going to come back. I don't know what I have to say to them. I don't know what to say to myself right now. Help me. How would you guide me?
Yeah, so I think the greatest thing that we can remember is that whatever clergy and leaders are experiencing, parishioners are experiencing that too. And there's a great gift in just being able to acknowledge this is hard and we don't know what we're doing and we're going to figure it out together, right? There's often this pull, especially for parish leaders, there's this pressure to know the right thing to do, right? And so that can kind of grind at people. And I was going to say it's not real. It is real. It's just not fair. And it's not, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? In the sense that none of us know what we're doing. Nobody knows. The government doesn't know what they're doing. Priests don't know what they're doing. Parents don't know what they're doing. Teachers don't know what they're doing. We're all just trying to figure it out, right? And so there can be some great relief in saying, let's articulate our values as a community and then use those values to guide our discernment process. And that frees me up as a leader from having all the right answers. Now, I really just need to convene space for us to be together.
Tell me that it seems too like there are a couple choices faced with, I don't know what to do. One is therefore I won't do anything, or the other is that's permission to try something I never would have tried before.
Yeah, and permission to fail forward, right? So if we've already established, if we've stipulated we don't know what we're doing and we try something and it, quote, doesn't work, cool, because we already didn't know what we were doing. Now let's try something else, right? I mean, that takes some play and some curiosity that for some of us, we might really need to engender if we haven't given ourselves permission to live into our faith in that way, but it can be a gift.
Yeah. So Alan asks, can you point to some trauma-informed resources for like a congregation that wants to work on this? So we're not talking about therapy counseling resources, but what can a congregation do? Are there some resources around that can help us as faith communities sort of address trauma in a healthy way? Yeah. In a healing way, I guess. Yeah.
A good resource that I'm a little bit biased here because I write for them sometimes, but I think they do a good job providing kind of wraparound think pieces for this kind of work is Duke Divinity's Faith and Leadership publication. It's an online publication, and they have writers from all over the country, theologians, mental health professionals, sociologists, community organizers, who really write on how do we as faith communities tackle these big questions. And one of the things they do really well is they're kind of constantly talking about the impact of COVID on our emotional experience, on our experience in faith communities. And so Duke Divinity's Faith and Leadership is a great resource. There are, I give the scholars like another 3 months or so to get those next books out. And there's going to be a slew of great pastoral care resources related to this. But I also want to stress that the strategies are not necessarily that different than what good pastoral care looks like.
Yeah.
Right. So we actually don't need new tools. What we need is the ability to hold space and the permission to tell the truth. Right. And I think that's something that we can do. We have access to that when, and this is particularly for the folks who are leading parishes, right? When we are able to do our own work around being okay with the uncertainty and working to not fix or cure, but move through and work with our own anxieties about the time we find ourselves in the world, then we're able to hold space for that. So I think it's really important to just remember that we actually do have these tools.
Yeah, we do.
Thank you, James, for putting that in the chat. I was
No problem.
We do have tools. We have to remind ourselves that we have them, and then to acknowledge that we might need to kind of timeshare what that looks like. So maybe my capacity is less, such that I can't do as much as I've always done.
Yeah.
And I can accept that and then share that responsibility with the other people who've been called.
It's a huge piece. We can't do everything, and maybe just not as much as we think we would have been able to do 2 or 3 years ago. You know, the other piece that I think sometimes is part of trauma for clergy is I'm worrying that everyone else's congregation is going to be fine and mine's not. And if I say mine's not, everyone else is going to say theirs is, because they don't want to lose face somehow. And we have this sort of sense of like, can we just be honest that we're all afraid of this, that we're all struggling with how to be church? A bunch of questions here. So hold on a second. Let me, so suggestions how to minister to a congregation that is split on the COVID experience as a trauma experience. Like some are feeling that it traumatized. Others are kind of going, oh, it's just like a flu. Get over it. How do you navigate some of that? Either of you, Jessica or Bob.
Yeah, if I can jump in, just a couple things. For those of who folks have been to, and we're moving into into this next segment to Prague, but there is located in there's something called the plague pillar. And the plague pillar, and maybe I'll find a picture of it if I've got it. I know I have them, but it is a three-sided, about 30 feet tall statue that is dedicated. It's kind of a theological statement of God and the plague. And I think what it reminds me of what Jessica's talking about is sometimes symbols and signs can tell us those stories and give people that meaning that says I'm okay, everything's okay. If I know I have that kind of touchstone out there, that symbolic. That's why memorials matter. And I think that's something that's available to us to allow people to tell those stories. And I guess if I look at kind of how did those clergy that survived the plague and pastored to their congregations during that, is they did what all good pastors do. They listened to the stories that people were telling about grief and suffering and loss, and held them for their people and allowed them to move to a new place.
The whole idea, the whole phrase of holding space or making space has complete new meaning for me, at least. It's a different way of being priest. I'm used to sort of creating a space, leading a space, particularly a worship space, right? That we've got a liturgy, we've got music, we've got a plan, and holding space is just this way of sort of making grace real right here by almost doing nothing but being a prayerful presence. And there's a vulnerability in that, I think, for at least for me as a priest, because it's a very different way of leading. I want to do something before we move on. I want to invite you all to put in chat real quick, and if we miss questions and you still want them answered, email them to Joe or me, and we'll email you back. They're coming so fast we can't get to them all, which is good. But if you email them to Joe or me, we will absolutely get them to Bob and Jessica and get you good answers and resources that we can find. But I'd love for you for a second to put in the chat, when you have wanted in your ministry just to get back to normal, what has it that has supported your inspiration or vision to do something new instead of just get back to normal, right? Because we were just saying, can we just pretend this never happened? We know we can, but what is it for you that's enabled you to move out of that just get back to normal push and to risk and anticipate seeing something new? So throw some of that in the chat if you would. What's helped you in that sort of to be a little bit visionary in this time? Would love to hear. There, Joe just put his address in there if you want to email questions that don't get answered, and we'll get you answers to them. So let's see if you have anything. The other question that I asked when we did this at the EPN conference was, and the three of us have talked about this, what do you imagine theologians 50 or 100 years from now will write about the last 2 years? What will they sort of say are the major theological shifts that this pandemic caused, right? Because Bob, we're going to talk about what some of those shifts were with that, with the Black Plague. Is it 600 years ago, 700 years ago?
673, yeah. So 1348, 1349 really.
Yeah, 1349 really. But somewhere, 50 or 100 years from now, people are going to write about theological shifts in what we understood to be church, that we can't write about them because we're living them right now, but someone's going to look back and say, here's what they did that shifted. But some things here, new people who've joined online and the expansion of an adult formation, providing hybrid options have been, although they've been work, a lot of people are saying it's actually been kind of fun to find a new way to do this and communicate. It has been energizing, and things can be both, right? They can be both energizing and a little tiring at the same time. I truly feel the Reformation is church as expressed through community and engaging as Christians in the world. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And there's one. We've always been following God. God's always been inviting us to something new. We get stuck in sort of wanting sort of routine predictability, and we do, don't we, have this wonderful Benedictine value of stability, which is not sameness and static, is it? Can't be. So there's a piece that we struggle with. But Bob, so there were after the plague happened, as we were saying, there was this push on the part of the church to sort of retake control or maintain control or be the way that we came to know God and that God was expressed. And then there were people that pushed against that, like there are now, and saying, wait a minute. You're going to talk to us about one of those in particular, aren't you?
Yeah. So there's really no way to capture the shifts that were going on, certainly in our time right now, no way to capture the shifts that were going on when the calendar turned January 1, 1300. I mean, the 1200s were the high point of medieval civilization. I mean, it was just chivalry, all of these other things that were just the ordered system, the changes that were, kind of the growth of so many of these medieval cathedrals that were happening during those times. But then, things began to change quickly. Britain and France were rising monarchies and powers, and that led to the 100 Years' War, which begins in 1337. And then the popes, right? Those who remember church history, the popes were in Avignon, and they were falling under the French monarchy's influence. And as a result, in England, the distrust of the papacy increased. It was just this natural things. And so these were pressures that were already in the water, already happening on the ground there, and they were accelerated by the plague. And so this weakened papal authority causes the popes to lash out, and which led to open criticism of them. And so perhaps the best example is this Bohemian priest his name is Jan Hus, and he was born in 1372, and he was a renowned preacher and scholar who eventually becomes the rector or president of the University of Prague in 1402. And he learns of the writings of the English philosopher John Wycliffe, and from that he quickly becomes a vocal church reformer, preaching at the Chapel of Bethlehem in Prague, which seats 3,000 people, and his views become popular. And you may recall that that Wycliffe's thinking was heretical. Well, Hus's became that as well. And so what were they? So first, I mean, some people are going to go, really? These are heretical? But oh yeah. He wanted to restore Christian life and the life of the clergy to its highest ideals. Okay, no big deal. How about this one? Hus affirmed the Bible's final authority. Those who are of the Protestant persuasion be like, well, yeah, of course he did. And when the Pope didn't follow it, no one had to obey the Pope. Okay, here we start to get into some more uncomfortable areas. He concluded that indulgences were wrong and only God could grant forgiveness. And then he was critical of the sale of church offices. If we remember back to church history, that's simony. So obviously the Pope didn't like what Hus was saying. And when Hus doesn't recant, on July 6th, 1415, he's burned at the stake. Soon after his death, a movement arises inspired by his teachings in martyrdom, and among other things, the Hussites, as they were known, argued for receiving communion in both kinds, utraquism, as it's known. They wanted more reforms, like everyone has the right to read the Bible. They rejected transubstantiation, ecclesial authority above that of a deacon or bishop, and rejected the notion of saints and the necessity of a pilgrimage. And Hus, like Wycliffe, were forerunners of the Reformation. So when Luther gets hauled in front of the papal court, he gets compared to Hus, and Luther had never heard of him, and so he goes and he reads about him, and then Luther immediately exclaims, "Yes, I am a Hussite." And so part of what, as we talk about what's going to be written in the next 50 to 100 years, some of these transitions, they do take time, but they're in the mix, and they're floating there and can be accelerated by things like the plague.
Yeah. So so we should be expecting then, with all of the upheaval in the way life has worked in the last couple of years, we should expect to be looking at what we understand as church and going, I'm not sure that it's working the way we want it to. Is that fair to say, Jessica?
Yeah, and I think a part of the challenge, if we submit to that, right, is also submitting to a process of allowing ourselves and our own vocational identities to evolve, right? Because if the place and the message get decentralized in some ways, then I might need to re-envision what it means for me to live into my own call. And that's an invitation. It doesn't have to be a burden, right? But it takes a shift. And the reality is, we've spent the last 20 minutes or so talking about the trauma that has been the past 2 years.
Yeah.
We also know that trauma limits our capacity, right? It's really hard to imagine if you're in survival mode, right? And so we can acknowledge the big ask it is to dream, to envision, to imagine as it feels like the world is falling around us. And maybe we can think about what it means to resource ourselves to do that, whether that's being in community, whether that's scaling back only to the things that are important when we tap into those key values. Maybe it's revisiting history and just reminding ourselves people who loved God and were in holy community have been through things before.
Yeah.
And God brought us through.
You just struck a chord, Jessica, because I'm thinking, all of a sudden the most essential touchstones of my identity, I can't go anoint the sick, right? I can't place the host in someone's hand or give them a sip of wine from a cup. I mean, these basic things of who I've been my entire adult life are gone. And so to push a little bit, I'm going to say, well, easy to say, Jessica, that, you need to examine your vocational identity. It's not examining it. It sometimes feels like maybe reinventing it. I mean, what are you seeing some of this? Is this?
Yeah, I am seeing it. I have people who are considering leaving parish ministry altogether, right? I have 2 people right now that I'm working with who are considering changing denominations, right? Yeah. And so here's the thing. That's really hard stuff, right? And especially the ministerial identity in a way that's different than many other vocational identities is such a part of how you envision yourself as a human being, right? Not just as a member of the workforce.
Yeah. So we should be sitting down with our clergy coach or with a colleague group or someone and being honest about all this, shouldn't we? That would be probably a good thing to do.
It's probably a good thing to do, right? And it's probably a good thing to remind ourselves that our humanity is not a threat to our call, right? Like we don't.
Would you say that again? Would you just say that sentence again, please?
Yeah, our humanity is not a threat to our call.
Yeah.
It enriches and enlivens and expands our call because it is the manner by which we connect to the people we're called to be in community with, right? And so imagine what it could be like for a leader to say, yeah, I'm rethinking everything. I joke with my clients all the time that in the past 2 years, I've blown my whole life up. Like I changed so many things about my life. Mm-hmm. And it is a reminder that there's no arrival point, right? We're in process. And so there doesn't have to be anything particularly threatening about uncertainty or about this moment where I'm not sure, because I'm constantly evolving.
Yeah, it's funny. So it's interesting to me that there's a way in which this reimagining is very similar to Reformation that, Bob, you were talking about. Mm-hmm. But I often think of Reformation as righting a wrong, but that's not necessarily always what it looks like.
Mm.
Yeah, if I could just say, again, in Prague, right? If you go to the central square in Prague, there's this enormous dark stone statue of Jan Hus standing there with people kind of, with his followers kind of around him. And he's there symbolically, kind of, he talk about everything being transformed, but he was leading people into something that was new, but also leading people back into what was old, reading, kind of reading and hearing scripture, but also meeting people's needs, right? And in all of that, it did result in some shifts of who he was and how he was doing that. But so much a part of what he was listening to his people and responding to them, saying, hey, here in Prague, this isn't working. People are hungry for something that is more than this elite group of people giving out information. People wanted to do it themselves and wanted to interact with God. It mattered, particularly after the plague.
And you've probably seen in the chat, Jessica and Bob, a lot of people saying, the church is not going to be bound by these walls anymore, that there's this sort of move. So next question for the chat here for you all. Keep going, because there's a lot of good stuff in the chat, but I've got another one that's intriguing to me. If we were out of this particular new pandemic, if we were going to start a movement of reform and renewal, sort of like Hus did, what would characterize this movement of reform and renewal now? And so if you think of anything, throw it in the chat. What would it be? What is it going to look like? What are people going to, again, look at and say, that was the Reformation of the early 21st century COVID pandemic? Here's what happened to the church, and what would you want to be the core, the identity of a reform movement now? So throw some of that in the chat, because I'm curious what some of that might be. We'll just sit with that for a minute. And then, we keep going here. Because there was another whole sort of, Donna says, beloved community. Amen, Donna, absolutely. Hopefully we're on that. And I hope this pandemic has accelerated that's a great vision for Reformation. But so you're going to talk to us now about, Julian, about what's the term? Anchorites? Is that the right?
We won't, and I'd love to, we could spend an hour on talking about anchorites and anchor holds and the fascination of what that is. But and it's a lovely way of doing one's religious life. Not my thing, but those that are called to it. I would say the post-pandemic period was a time of great mysticism. Julian is an example of that. And the first 14th century, in fact, is considered to be the golden age of mysticism. There were about 25 mystics in that were living and writing in the Western Europe at that period. And the big four that we all as Episcopal Anglicans should know are Richard Rolle, R-O-L-L-E, Walter Hilton, the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, and Julian of Norwich. They're really the ones, the pivotal ones in England. What Bernard McGinn, who is a big historical writer on mysticism, he notes that the remarkable production of mystical literature in England after 1340, so really after the plague, was something unexpected. And given the literacy rates of everybody that during that time, which was high, many people read what they wrote. So it had a profound impact. Much different than the previous century's scholastic theology. Late 14th century theology was a vernacular one. And to give the definition that McGinn gives us, it's a mode of understanding faith that aims for an intellectual and lived experience of belief open to all believers, and not just one filtered down through monastic or scholarly trained clerics. And of note, vernacular theology opened the door to religious innovation. So certainly in that case, and Julian is a great example. She was born in Norwich in 1342, only 6 years before the plague hit England. In 1373, she's severely ill, near death, and she received 16 visions. And so through her vision, here's some theological things that she gained. Her visions, she developed an image of God as motherhood, God's motherhood. She didn't develop that image, it was there, but God's motherhood is equivalent to God's fatherhood. And she tied the physical motherhood to God's act of self-giving. And that was a bold assertion. And she also heralded the dignity of women. Another focus, and this, perhaps those who know Julian know of this quote, But another of Julian's theology, a focus of her theology, was this understanding of time. And McGinn, again, gives us some background. God reminds Julian that he does not see things in terms of a distinct past, present, and future. And for this reason, Julian can say, all will be well and all manners of things will be well. And so the mystics' impact on the church during that time was profound. John Van Engen described the post-plague church. Here's a really interesting understanding. So from 1370s to 1520s, right prior to the Reformation, he describes it as a carnival of religious options, multiple, competing, contested, coexistent, negotiated, overlapping, local, and personally appropriated. And perhaps the two most significant changes were in the relationship between authority and communicability in language. And the mystics' goal was to speak directly to God and transform their lives through such intimate contact. That's a step. That's a big, profound step that was not anticipated coming out of the time of Aquinas.
Yeah, wow, that's a huge shift.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, one way it seems, Bob, to sort of describe that is we move from a very top-down sort of pyramid-shaped thing to a very horizontal shaped sense of community and faith, right?
Right. And you know, some of this is as Protestants we go, well, of course, right? But the Catholic side of us Anglicans, you know, think, well, wait a minute, you know, am I okay as a person to a sinful person to interact with God? You know, those are some of the big changes that are there.
Yeah. So Jessica, do you think that that these 18 months of isolation and then semi-isolation and then in and out, and then, you know, we can go to a restaurant and then we can't, and then we go to church and then we can't, and then we're wearing a mask and we're not, and all that, have people found are there folks that have found a more sort of direct experience of God, a more intimate experience of God than they might have had otherwise? Did this push some of that might not have been around in a lot of people's lives?
Yeah, you know, I think we've been forced to, right? So as human beings, we crave connection, and we've had to think about how to connect in different ways. We've seen some of the ways our traditional religious structures were not adequate to help us tackle these big questions. And so we've been forced to chart our own path in some ways. The gift there is we really open up our capacity to see just how big God is, right?
Mm.
Because if we let people know they can speak to God directly, then what we know is God will speak to those people directly, right? And so the same God can engage all of us at our point of need in these different ways. And there's an opportunity to, I think, expand our reach such that these deaths maybe are really just precursors to beginnings that can be more expansive and more meaningful.
Yeah. This doesn't, in other words, that kind of a personal immediacy doesn't have to supplant the church, right?
No. And in fact, it might even increase and deepen the way people engage with the church, right? Because now maybe I'm not doing something out of duty, but I'm doing it from a deep sense of personal call and commitment, right? And so people can engage at a different level.
Yeah. I've wondered, and actually even before pandemic, I wondered if one of the things we're going to see is maybe we're going to see as organized churches is lower attendance, higher commitment.
Yeah. And even maybe more decentralized attendance, right? Maybe attendance isn't just the people who come to the building. Maybe attendance is the people who are watching on live stream but are giving and supporting the ministries of the church from all over the country, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which Lene says in the chat. She goes to a morning prayer group that has people in 4 states regularly. Yeah.
I would
we had
have
a baby dedication at my church,
Yeah.
and someone who lived in another state, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we can do things differently.
Yeah, I would add that, you're just kind of, as you're both are saying, that for Julian, her personal faith doesn't alienate her from the church. In fact, she lives attached to the church and with a window into the church by which she can only see the altar. I mean, that's a deepening devotion for her in this anchor hold she isn't giving up on church just because she's had a deep experience and personal experience in God. It's actually the church is framing her experience for her.
So either one of you, Bob or Jessica, can you think of current examples of vernacular theology that aren't just sort of, I mean, there's part of me that says that sort of sounds like just freewheeling, making it up as I go along, grounded in nothing, which it's not, right? It's not that. So are there some examples that you could think of vernacular theology from now that it's something like the mystics?
I think of the broadening of understanding of real presence of God, and how this sense of and the raising the question of okay, if I'm not in church but I'm watching church from home, and I can't receive communion or but I'm receiving it through prayer. Is that any less than the person who can go up to the altar rail? I mean, I think that's an interesting question, don't you?
In fact, I had people, who were on Zoom every week and finally came up to me as we were coming back in person some and saying, really, really worried and a little guilty that they say, when you put the bread and wine on the altar, we got our bread and wine out at home. Is that bad? And I'm like, no. I said, I'm not going to tell you to do it, but no, that's not bad. Is that kind of what we're talking about, like that? And that was some way that was sacramental for them.
Right.
I don't know how to fit that into our theology, Bob. Right. But
as an Episcopalian, I'm quickly running out of rope and
I'm walking away. Right.
Plank,
Okay,
this might be an issue for you.
Get your bread and wine at home. Right. So
exactly.
Here's the thing. I think there are opportunities for us to ask really interesting, curious questions about doctrine, right? Which is, for me, the doctrinal questions are always, is this pointing the way to God? Right? And so I think we have opportunity to ask those questions. The other question I think we offer with this move toward a vernacular theology is, can we expand the people who we endow with spiritual authority? Can we expand the list of those people so that their visual representation, their sociocultural location is more representative of the people we're calling to be in relationship with God? And for me, that's the real gift.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, that's the journey. And I think, Jessica, that we may as Episcopalians have a little more, I don't know, what do we have? Is it baggage, inertia, tradition, something, right? That sort of.
Yeah, we could call it scaffolding, framing out of things that allow it's our liturgy, our tradition gives us the framework that we don't have to worry about a lot of different things in order to experience God. I mean, I like to think of it that in a positive sense of saying, if I know what to expect in my ritual when I enter a building or I view something online, then I don't have to be thinking about, well, oh, how is this different? How do I experience this? I can just let go and be a part of that stream and know that it's not going to take me someplace where it's going to threaten me or be to beyond what I can handle, right? And kind of support me in those dangerous waters, even if because I know that the structure's there to care for me.
But you're not saying, I mean, we wouldn't say though that there's some absolutely consistent, never changing sacramental theology that's been the same for 2,000 years. That doesn't mean that we can't, that our sacramental theology, our understanding of the presence of Christ in this, how we're connected in this, all the things Jessica was saying, that doesn't mean that we don't have the capacity to sort of move with that, right?
Right.
And then for me, it doesn't mean, to your point, Bob, that those rituals and traditions are bad, right? They can be enriching, and even more so when we choose them, right? So I think that's the gift, that we sort of engage at a different level of meaning. And it allows people to, for me at least, go deeper and wider.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Bishop Sage said, to me, a significant concern is allowing the gifts we received and lessons we've learned during this time to just slip away and be forgotten. There's still, I mean, despite all this that we've talked about, there's this massive, I use the word inertia, and maybe there's a better word, but this inertia, just again, to go back to what we've been doing, to what we've known, to what we thought was working, although the fact is it hadn't really been working. And so, but how do we, oh, Guy, it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you know, Puss was burned at the stake, you know, I mean, you know, it is the first, those that first took those steps, you know, it didn't work out well. For Luther, it was fine, you know, I mean, Luther got to, you know, 100 years later, but it was a little rough at the beginning to say that we're making these changes. So I would love to say, you know, it's going to be easy to hang on to what's new, that is life-giving, versus what's old and safe and is not, because there's a lot of entrenchment and a lot of power and the way things are established. So what the new is you know, quite the challenge.
Yeah. So Paul Shatford says, what did they do after the plague to grow the church? Or were they even talked about church growth after the plague? But what did they do? I mean, was there the same existential threat, I guess, that we're facing now with that plague? I'm not sure there's a parallel to that, is there?
Yeah, I mean, we're still functioning under kind of the Constantinian model of church, where, you know, you're born into the church. You know, there wasn't this sense of multi-faith, multi-denominational understanding at that point. But that's what's coming, you know, historically. I mean, what is going to happen is the church is going to begin to break apart, you know, and the local, because the local expression of faith, that vernacular theology, was so powerful, right? And so, yeah, I would say, no, the church wasn't under threat in that way, but the church power structure was.
Yeah.
And the way the church was expressing itself was. There was a massive movements toward, you know, beginning of all of the things that we kind of take for granted now, right? You know, to read the Bible in the language of our own tongue, you know, to know clergy can't just, you know, have ultimate power over us, and some faraway authority can't dictate exactly how I worship. I mean, those are the big changes. Now, how does that, you know, so yeah, they're not the same challenges, but there is still the challenge of saying, well, who is my intermediator of my faith? You know, who is my teacher of my faith? Who shapes my faith and how it's expressed? You know, is that in ways that feed me? Because that's the important piece, right? Is that through all of this, kind of a vernacular theology it suddenly was feeding people immensely, because they were able to read for themselves what the word said, and all of a sudden they found out that the clergy didn't know quite as much as they thought.
So I have one more question for people to put some stuff in the chat that I'd love to hear about all this that we've talked about. How has your understanding and articulation of your vocation, whatever your vocation or calling from God is, how has that evolved or been transformed over the past 2 years? What's happened in your sense of who you are as a child of God, what you're called to as a child of God? How has that shifted? Have yours shifted, Bob and Jessica? I would say I mean, I said this earlier, Jessica, but I think it's this notion of holding space that my shift for me is realizing that some of what I need to do is just make a place for people to be together with God. I don't have to have answers. I don't always even have to have a sermon. Sometimes I do, but I don't always have to have, you know, the outline or the manuscript or the PowerPoint or the, you know, figuratively speaking. I can just be there. But what has it been for you all? What's shifted? Anything?
Yeah, I think it's been a similar thing for me. I've certainly had to relinquish the expert role in a lot of the places where I find myself, because nobody knows what we're doing. You know, I have no idea. And, you know, I spent all of 2020 holding space while dealing with my own stuff, right? And it's just like, I can't fake this. So I have to just admit that I have no idea, but I trust the process. And I trust, above all, I trust God. Right. And so I think that for me has been really transformational. I also have been forced to just kind of recklessly extend grace because it's just hard being a human right now. And if I can give somebody a break, I'm going to do that. And that includes me.
Yeah. And you said recklessly extend grace, right?
Yes.
Love that term. Recklessly extend grace. Yeah.
Yeah, I would, where I am, and this is part of the current writings and research, is really in this idea that, and we'll use it in a liturgical role here, is that when I hold the bread or body of Christ, when I look into the cup and the blood of Christ is there, the wine is there, you know, it can that in a spiritual way, and this is actually very true of our Episcopal nature, is that has being and substance that can look back at us, right? And what does it mean when the body and blood of Christ looks at us before we consume it and bring it into ourselves? What is the perfect, and that's, you know, we, in a sense, it's holding space in that moment before we, you know, when the priest puts in our hand, we say amen, throw it in our mouth, and off we go. But to sit there and say, what is God, you know, this is God, I am holding the presence of God in my hand, and what is it seeing in me? And that's a profound, I think that's a profound way of interacting with God that is there in our Episcopal theology, and we haven't taken advantage of.
You sparked something too, Bob, both of you, just in what you all just said. It seems to me, I'm realizing, you know, we're 4 days away from celebrating the resurrection. We're 2 days away from our Triduum journey, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter, which you said you do, Jessica, right? You observe those as Baptist, still learning my Baptist traditions here. But and we're doing it this year. I mean, at least here, we're allowed to have a common cup here. I don't think that's going to change before Easter. Although we're doing it in a lot of different ways in this diocese, but they're really, if there were ever going to be a sense in the last 2 years of getting back to normal, I think that's possible with these next 4 days. And I'm realizing what I want to pray for is that that's not what we do this Easter, even if it looks like this, that this Triduum and this Easter day are just suffused with the sense of newness, of aliveness, of the kind of joy, the sort of unimagined joy, the unexpected joy, I can't believe it's true joy of the first hearers of the good news that Christ rose. The realization that nothing is the same. It absolutely isn't. And man, wouldn't it be cool if we could all come to church this Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and have that kind of experience? Not, oh, isn't this nice to be back to normal? But this, oh my gosh, wait a minute. We're now through there's a very real way now in which we're through this 2 years of whatever this 2 years has been. And as several people said in the chat, we can't go back. We don't want to go back. In fact, I don't want to go back. There's something wonderful ahead for us.
And I think Richard's point in the chat about the power of lament, I think is really poignant too, because we can hold both of those things, right?
Yeah.
We can grieve and lament because they're very real losses that we've got to reckon with and integrate into this sense of newness that we want to celebrate and live into. And so I think it's so important to be able to just name and hold those things at the same time.
Yeah, lament and gratitude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think of the women going to the tomb that morning.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, massive grief, unfathomable grief. And you still see it even as they touch Jesus, even as they hear the words of the angel, he's not here, he's risen, come and see, all those things. That grief doesn't magically disappear, does it? That hardship, that, oh my gosh, what they've been through is still part of who they are.
And I think in some ways it's necessary for full celebration, right? I mean, I think about people use the scripture, Jesus wept all the time, right? Jesus was weeping in response to Lazarus's death, knowing that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, right? And so we can do all of that. And there's a biblical model for grieving as we prepare for celebration.
Good stuff. Well, I thank you both. Thank you both. I have had so much fun getting a chance to talk to the two of you, and I feel encouraged and deeply grateful for both of you and the your work and your ministry of the church, in your scholarly work and your relationships that you build, and the fact that you both got things that we can read further and learn more. And thank you for this time.
Yeah. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, James.
Yeah.
Thank you both. It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
And everyone who's joined us, thank you for coming. Lots more EPN workshops. So come join them online. And as I said, if there's something we didn't address that you want us to, email Joe and he'll get it to us, and we'll give you good answers, because it was just wonderful to have more than we can get to in an hour. But everyone, all of you are in my prayers as we celebrate this Holy Weekend Easter, that it will be truly a time of new life for all of us as we emerge from this. Thanks. God bless everyone. Take care.
You too. Peace.